So we've showed that to determine monetary policy, optimal monetary policy, we need two sufficient statistics. The first sufficient statistic is, that's the unemployment gap. So the gap between the actual and the efficient unemployment rate, but that we've already showed that that's actually not too difficult to compute in the data. And in particular, in the US, a quite accurate formula is just U minus square root of UV. So that's really simple. The second statistic is the monetary multiplier. So the monetary multiplier, it's a statistic that gives the response of the unemployment rate in percentage point, du, when the nominal interest rate goes up by 1 percentage point, so du di, which is of course positive because when you increase nominal interest rate, the unemployment rate tends to increase. And so what I want to discuss a bit is how we can measure that monetary multiplier, because it's a key input into the design of optimal monetary policy. And so, of course, the challenge, as you can imagine, is that, so ideally what you would want is you just want a change in the nominal interest rate that's completely exogenous. For no reason, the Fed increase the nominal interest rate, and then you want to trace how, with nothing else happening around, how the unemployment rate is going to respond. Okay, so that's the ideal experiment. Of course, the big challenge to measure this monetary multiplier and to measure the impact of micro policies in general is that it never happens that micro policy change for no reason. The Fed is never going to just change the nominal interest rate, the Fed funds rate for no reason, just randomly. Essentially that doesn't happen because, their job is to change the nominal interest rate for a reason. So usually what happens that say unemployment is going up, so the Fed is going to respond by reducing rates, or unemployment is going down, the Fed is going to respond by increasing rates. So all these changes in the nominal interest rate, they are never exogenous, they're always endogenous to the current situation. And so that makes it very tricky to measure the monetary multiplier. And so, of course, macroeconometricians, they've developed a range of methods to try to measure the effect of monetary policy on aggregate variables, and in particular on the unemployment rate, and to try to isolate exogenous variations in the nominal interest rate. So that's the challenge, try to find exogenous variations in the nominal interest rate and then see how they impact the economy. And so you have a whole literature that tries to do that using VARs and variation of the VAR, vector autoregressions. So you have a big literature that looks at that, that try to study using these VARs and compute the monetary multiplier. And so here, good resource if you want to see a bit what are the challenges of these VARs are implemented. Cristiano, Eichenbaum, and Evans have a very nice survey in the Handbook of Macroeconomics, 1999. So they have a very nice survey that kind of summarize all the results from this VAR literature and discuss a bit all the challenges. Then if you want something a bit more recent, Valérie Remy also has a nice survey that's of course more updated, that came almost 20 years later, that's also in the Handbook of Macroeconomics, but the next iteration. And so you can see a little bit how this is done and what are the challenges. So here, to try to get an estimate, I'm going to use a recent paper by Oli Kwabion. And the reason why I picked that paper is that, so it's quite nice, it surveys the whole previous literature, but also it contrasts different methods and try to propose a hybrid method that combines all the insight from the literature. So I think it's a good starting place to get a good estimate of the monetary multipliers. So Quabion runs some vars, and so what he finds is that with a VAR, and he runs a bunch of them, but with a VAR he finds DU, DI about 0.2. Okay, so that means that when you increase the nominal interest rate by 1 percentage point, the unemployment rate is going to increase by 0.2 percentage point. Okay, and if you go back to Cristiano et al. Survey and Valerie Remy's survey, that's kind of in the ballpark of what people have found using VAR. One exception that we've talked about is Bernanke and Blinder, which is a very nice early paper using VAR and looking at the impact of monetary policy on unemployment. These guys tend to find a higher monetary multiplier. They have something around 0.6. Okay, but that's kind of the exception. Usually in the VAR literature, the multipliers, the monetary multipliers are fairly low. Okay. Now, the VAR literature, it's not without problems. It's tricky to estimate these exogenous changes in monetary policy. So there's a totally different approach that tries to find exogenous changes in monetary policy and study their impact. That's the narrative approach. And that narrative approach that was pioneered by Christian David Romer, and they have a very nice paper, 2004, that looks at that use that narrative approach to find the effect of monetary policy on unemployment. So that's something that's totally different from the VAR approach, which is very econometric. The narrative approach, the idea is you go back to all the transcript of the Fed, all that describe how the Fed has made decisions over the years. And all of that is publicly available, and you try to separate decisions that the Fed makes because they look at the conditions and they decide to adjust their interest rate in response to these conditions. So for instance, today the nominal interest rate is going up, but of course, that's not random. It's because inflation is very high. So clearly, these policy decisions are driven by the current circumstances. So you can put that aside, but then they try to isolate other decisions that are more idiosyncratic. They try to find times when the Fed kind of woke up in a bad mood and decide to increase rate, or woke up in a good mood and decide to reduce rate. And so looking at the transcript of all these decisions, they try to find these idiosyncratic decisions that are really not driven by the current condition. And so they isolate this. They construct a series of shocks of monetary policy using only this idiosyncratic decision, and then based on that, they can measure the impact of monetary policy on unemployment. And generally, they find a much larger number. So in the narrative approach, you tend to find much larger multiplier. So in the Quabion paper, so what's nice in that Quabion paper is that it contrasts the two approaches. And so in the Quabion paper, so he also kind of replicates the narrative approach. And so with the narrative approach, what he finds is DUDI, if I remember correctly, yes, he finds a much bigger DUDI, around 0.9. So this is an estimate where the Fed has a much bigger, stronger impact on unemployment. So of course, it's a little bit of a challenge, if you want to use our formula, and you have to pick a value of the multiplier. So you have to decide, okay, do I go with 0.2? Do I go with 0.9? Of course, that leads to very different response of the interest rate, because you remember that the response of the interest rate is the unemployment gap divided by the multiplier. So if you divide by 0.2, it means that you need to multiply your unemployment gap by 5. If you divide by, say, 0.91, you just change the interest rate by the value of the unemployment gap. And so, if your unemployment gap is 1 percentage point, in one case you change your interest rate by 1 percentage point, in the other case you change it by 5 percentage point. This is a very big impact on how you conduct policy. So it's very important to try to get a bit of consensus and try to get a narrower range of estimate of the multiplier to be more certain about how we want to conduct monetary policy. Now, of course, in typical models, in the New Keynesian model, the monetary multiplier doesn't show up in policy. People just assume that there's some Taylor rule, and then you can run simulation, find the coefficient of the Taylor rule. So there's no sense in which that statistic of the monetary multiplier is useful in a New Keynesian world. But then it's kind of strange because people do measure this type of multipliers empirically. They do feel that it's kind of a useful thing. What's nice with the approach that we've taken here and looking at this this sufficient statistic approach to monetary policy is that then we can make use of that monetary multiplier, which has been estimated but never used in the New Keynesian literature. So I think it's a good thing, and it makes sense that people were interested in that multiplier, and it makes sense that it's useful to determine policy. So anyway, here we have this kind of broad range. But so what's quite nice is that then Quabion in his paper, he designs an hybrid approach that merge the VAR and the narrative approach. And there, what he finds is that once he uses that hybrid approach that mixes VAR and the narrative approach, he gets a multiplier, of du di is equal to 0.4. So actually in between 0.2 and 0.9. And then he runs a bunch of robustness check. And overall what he finds is that the multiplier always falls across different specifications. It always falls in a fairly narrow range. So whatever you do, you always find a multiplier between 0.4 and 0.6. So that's quite reassuring, is that you have an approach where you get something that's in between the more extreme approach and something that's quite stable and robust to different specifications. So you get something that's always below 0.4, 0.6. And so here, so it's good to know that range. And here in the application that we're going to do, we are going to use the midpoint of that range as a value for the monetary multiplier, which I think is fairly reasonable. So here we take the midpoint estimate, which is something that we often do when we have range of estimate for the sufficient statistic. And so that's going to give us kind of as a starting point, du di is equal to 0.5. I think that's a good starting point. And then we're going to use that now to study optimal monetary policy, and then see also whether what the Fed does is in line with what comes from these estimates.